measurement for ego. And I've come to realize that ego is directly related to the potential response to an experience. Since ego is related to confidence of self, right? Confidence of self is confidence in your understanding, your beliefs, regardless of if it's tied to the truth or not. Again, following along character. So it depends on character as well as what we're experiencing next, right? So to word this is always the difficult part, but ego is basically the idea, and this I think ties back to when we look at ego in the psychological sense. Where there's what was it? There's super ego and ID. We have here preservation of oh, there we go. So this is a resource. ID, instinct driven, pleasure seeking part of the mind, focus on immediate gratification. I mean, this is true. Our excitement, our emotional response, how we feel about things drives our ego, right? And how we perceive what is good to us, what gives us that stimuli, are things that promote our existence or the existence of things that we like. And typically, the things that we like, and this is in a cyclical nature, the things that we like are typically things that promote our own existence, our own beliefs. It feeds back in to the ego. Ego being the rational mediator that balances the ideas, impulses with real world constraints. So, the character being from, ID and superego, the moral conscience representing societal and parental standards, striving for ideal behavior. We can simplify this as meaning, again, preservation of existence. Because what is ideal behavior? Things that promote existence, whether it's existence of self or existence of those that you love or of others in general. So all these relate in that sense. So this is how we can tie to our current understanding and derivation of ego in these aspects when considering the measurement. So again, ego is the response to experience depending on character as well as the perceived experience. So character versus mm, our own perspective, basically. And our perspective with ego being belief in self, how egotistical someone might be, again, doesn't matter if they understand things truly or not, because again, we're comparing to truth, to reality, regardless of delusion or possibility of such delusion. But to make sense of that, because there are fundamental limits on what we can perceive and what we can understand within the universe, no matter the scale, because we can't see everything at every single level at any instance, right? So there are real limits, which involves us taking time to understand things. And ego is the part that allows us to take that time to understand if that is what we believe is how understanding works. So it's relative to the true understanding of the experience, right? So character versus true understanding. True understanding measured from, the character itself, but also character versus reality, right? At least this is me trying to figure that out. And ego, I mean, regardless of how well you understand something or not, is how true you believe something to be. How much faith you have in that, how much faith you have in yourself and your own beliefs, which will determine the type of responses that you'll have to further experiences with the character you've built. That's why ego is dependent on character or ID, in a sense. And well, ID and superego, because superego, like we just went over, has to do with what you believe is morally ideal. And when we think of the typical moral ideal beliefs of a human being in general, is preservation of existence, of the things that you believe will preserve your existence. So, and that's why ego can be bad, especially if there's too much ego and believing in things that you might believe will preserve your existence, but actually do not. That's why it's goes against, or is measured against, the true understanding, right? Because there's understanding and misunderstanding, but there's the truth that can be either understood or misunderstood. So it's character versus truth of experience. So, mm, to word this, processing of the individual. So, I want to say possibility, or well, because it has to do with response to an experience based off character. So, maybe more simply put, see, it depends on character from established beliefs regardless of truth. Or, well, I should just say depends on character. Because as character itself is defined by, the beliefs based on perceived and lived experience. So it depends on character versus understanding of true understanding. True understanding of reality. Because that's what we're measuring against. As, I mean, someone can be divorced from reality and have a huge ego, right? They can have full belief in themselves, and that's because of what came from the character. But in regards to reality, this is how we can measure where ego is either good or bad. The more aligned character is to true understanding of reality, then the greater the possibility is of truly preserving existence, truly preserving self. So it depends on character of self, or of the individual, character of the individual individual versus true understanding of reality, right? And this dictates response to future experiences. This is where the feedback loop exists. So it'll go, you have an experience builds character based on the differences that exist between consciousness and intelligence of that individual, how well they understand the truth of the reality, depending on what they perceive and what they understand. Going into ego, as ego is built on the beliefs which build the character. And the beliefs come from the experiences, so then when new experiences happen, because of the decisions of the ego from the past, or because environment or whatever, any other factors that introduce experience, because experience happens over time. And there's no way of stopping experience because we're all experiencing everything over time. So it's a constant feedback loop, and this will take into account all three possible forms of actions, which, I mean, well, two, because everything is technically a reaction from the initial, but depending on the route of observation and the path of observation and analysis, that will determine understanding as well and factor into it, depending on the types of considerations involved in the analysis, right? So to put it lightly, depends on character of the individual, or it should be potential response. Response depending potential of response depending on character of the individual versus true understanding of reality, which this is, I want to say, confidence factor. Or faith in faith in understanding, or faith in beliefs versus true understanding or understanding of truth. So not it well, because it doesn't matter what is actually true in reality when it comes to confidence, because you can be confident in something that doesn't matter. So confidence, or it is faith in beliefs of, or which make character. Faith in beliefs which confidence factor, or faith in beliefs versus beliefs of understanding. Because to one person, understanding can mean multiple things. Depends on the factors that's being weighed. So having faith in the beliefs of understanding doesn't necessarily mean that the understanding is true to reality. It could be more aligned to delusion or imagination, which can be tied loosely to reality in some way or actual truth. But depending on what is considered and what is, depending on the amount of time that's taken to achieve true understanding, is going to determine as well the response or the type of response. Because if you do something, say, if you believe in the rapture and you decide to sell your house because you believed in the rapture and thought that, hey, I'm such a good individual because I feel like I've been morally upstanding and doing all this other stuff, and then the fact remains that the rapture doesn't actually exist in the way that you think it does, right? There's a lot of ego involved in that decision because there was so much confidence. The confidence factor was so great because of that faith in beliefs of understanding versus true understanding of reality, which ties into lived experience, because truth of reality of the experience is just 100% true. The true consequences of an experience that is lived through of any form of consciousness happens. It is observed. When it is observed, then it definitely happens. There is some way to record that happening, that experience. So, and then to put it relative to our current understanding, I'll do a different color. Purple. I'll do purple. So let's see. So we have character. So we have both. Hold on. ID and ego, and then ego is the how much you believe in both of those things, how self-confident you are, or ego negotiates between the impulse ID and the judgmental superego, and both of those come from character, right? Or well, consciousness and character, that whole process. Character, I guess, because impulsive ID has to do with consciousness fundamentally. And right here we have consciousness versus intelligence when it comes to character. Intelligence relative to understanding, and understanding of existence, and preservation of existence, and significance of existence lends to the cycle. So, superego, because moral conscience, again, has to do with striving for ideal behavior, as well as ID is, the feedback system, the internal feedback system of comfort, right? Comfort, immediate gratification, being sure that existence is preserved, existence of self, and of the things that you find morally ideal are preserved. So, and the ego is what drives, or not doesn't mediate, but derives actions from the individual and perpetuates continuing actions and responses to experiences, which may also create more experiences as time, or different experiences. I wouldn't say more, because to measure experience, I want to say time itself. It's the experience is equal, that we all experience time linearly to one another, right? We all follow the same calendar, same clock, essentially. Sure, there's time zones or whatever, but that's a consideration of distance over time. So to say that someone has more experiences, well, the only way that they really have more experiences is if they existed longer than you. Hmm. So, character is built on superego and ID. Built from superego versus ID. And that's relative to how well we understand something, or, well, consciousness versus intelligence. Intelligence, probably the first, so I should say ID versus superego. Because ID is like the actual gratification from understanding, I guess, or of preservation of existence. So that again depends on understanding and misunderstanding, because ignorance is bliss, right? That's one way to also look at it. Friggin' train. So you can still have gratification from something that doesn't necessarily preserve existence, but gets rid of something that you might believe harms existence. That still matters. But when it comes to morals, morals are fundamentally ground in preservation of existence by definition, right? Because to be moral is to preserve good, and what we perceive as good are things that preserve our own experience and the experiences of other things. So, built from ID versus superego, relative, or I should say, it's directly relative to consciousness versus intelligence. We'll do that. So just like here, these factors, by definition, are fundamentally related. So as we just described, and I'll expand more over here, but this is, since we just made this connection, and ego is the process should move this down here. I mean, again, the processing of the individual. And both lived and perceived, because both play a factor into the type of response. Experiences both lived and perceived Yeah, both lived and perceived as measured between, as measured within character, as measured within character, right? And this will determine how confident someone may or may not be to commit to certain forms of actions in responses to experiences. As we see that character, boom, there we go, that looks a little better. Down 10, there we go. As this cycle occurs, an ego is introduced into the experience, which ego is introduced through forms of action, and not just forms of action, but probable forms of action. Not just possible, because there's a lot of things that are possible, but the limitation which makes it probable, which we can consider as probable, is that confidence factor. The confidence to do certain actions, which turns possibility more so into probability, and it's even more easily measured. As someone that has a character that was built in living in fear, for instance, against political dissonance, is more likely than not they're going to remain inactive because their ego is pressed down. They are being repressed because their beliefs and their confidence in beliefs conflicts with the ego, and, well, the egos of those around themselves, which is our measure of anxiety, right? So a lot of that plays a role. And then from here, this is where we can add in the nuances to emotional response. So now, last part is the emotional response, right? Because character will dictate the kind of responses, and the kind of responses are going to be relative to moral beliefs, like the superego or the intelligence factor, how well you believe and understand in the true preservation of existence versus what you were fed to believe or might have learned to believe in different ways, right? Like learn or being told that a certain group of people were always bad, but you never really got to experience life with them, right? You didn't get to experience why they made the decisions that they did. This is basically the normal trope of a lot of movies out there when it comes to conflicts and people persevering through conflicts and coming to resolution over time, to better understanding of each other, to managing the collective ego of society in order to promote more true moral upstanding character, and therefore more true real preservation of existence of humanity itself, essentially. So, oof, last section to really expand upon, and then we draw a big arrow, big circle that connects it all, right? All right, so the factors that we need to elaborate on relative to ID and superego. So the ID factor ID is emotional response relative to, so ID we can define as the emotional response, that sensation of gratification relative to existence and preservation, or exist perpetuation of existence, perpetuation and preservation of perceived or well of existence of, or well just existence of self. mm, so emotional response relative to perpetuation and preservation of existence of self and others, which objective morality, belief of. mm, from perceived understanding, or well it could be perceived. I before you accept after C. Good. And I can put that in the brackets. So this is ID is dependent. I mean, our emotional response is dependent on what we believe to be morally objective. It's relative to the superego. Super ego, right? Because it is in response to the consequence of an experience which leads to, so emotional response to consequence of an experience relative to perpetuation and preservation of existence of self and others. Following belief. All right, there we go. There we go. Or perceived good. Um, relative to superego. And then superego. Because both of these things make up the character. And then ego is the process of filtering experiences through that individual character in order to facilitate further actionable responses, or well, further response in general. So we have that. I wanted to put a box around that though. Do that, sure. Maybe extend this way. Cool. So then super ego. Which, as we went over, the moral conscience, which we go to definition of conscience, or well, definition of moral. Definition. Can I get the thank you? Concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior and goodness or badness of human character. Right? There's your connection right there. And goodness or badness is directly relative to how we perceive existence. So, superego equals was it laid out there? Yeah. ID is consciousness. Consciousness, because consciousness leads to emotional response. It's that process that allows for emotional response, whereas intelligence is relative to truth. So superego relative to true understanding in regards to existence. Existence or perpetuation of existence of self and of other factors related to preservation of existence. In perpetuation? No. It's a little fumbly. Let's see. Besides a shitty frozen stream, it's constantly getting unstable connections. Sick. So superego means morals, or moral compass. Let me do this, and then a little bit of changing color. Green? Yeah, green. So do that. Because superego is regardless of emotions. Because your emotions can go against your actions, right? You can be unsure of things. You can have doubts. You can also try to think. I mean, you could try to think. But relative to true understanding in regards to perpetuation of existence of self and of other factors related to preservation of existence. I mean, that puts it nicely. Morality. or the measure of morality. Is that a word? Ethicality? It's 1L. It is a word though. Because that's the type of consideration that's being weighed, right? When it comes to preservation of existence, because there's also preservation of resources. It just depends relative to the true understanding. Or, well, it could be relative to the individual's understanding as well. So, relative to true understanding, there's a relationship between true understanding of lived and perceived experiences. Of reality. Facilitate. Relative to true understanding of reality, to facilitate perpetuation of existence of self and of other factors related to preservation of existence of perceived good. Yeah, that's the other thing too. What's perceived good and what's perceived bad. So to expand on that next, so measure of morality versus ethicality. And that's what the perceived good is. Because I mean, we can consider things that are bad, that are detrimental to existence of an individual, morally good for preservation of the existence of the whole, right? Sacrifice. And that's also something that comes from consciousness, right? It doesn't mean that you might be necessarily intelligent. It just depends on the experience and the set of circumstances that are being experienced, which is depends on the environment and other characters that are involved. So, I before E except after C. Keep forgetting that. There we go. So now lastly, we're going to expand upon emotions. So emotional response. Because this is part of the driver for ego is our emotions, our reflection, and our emotions are based on what we understand of any given experience or situation. And it's related to superego, like the preservation of self and other factors. It's all relative to the belief of survival and instinct, like we went over previously. So therefore, to finish off, do. So good versus bad. Her emotional response is driven by hmm, just having to think of how to word this. Hmm. I'm gonna have to scroll down. Meh. Oh no. Move that back up. There we go. This one's gonna be elongated. There we go. It's not gonna fit on one thing, but whatever. So emotional response is driven by perceived good versus perceived bad relative to understanding of experiences and existence itself. Instinct is one inherent example where survival and perpetuation of existence of self is a fundamental quality of consciousness, as, I mean, all animals experience, really, as all forms of biological life experience. So this will tie into ID, again, that gratification of survival, to be able to live another day, to be able to live and exist in order to allow the possibility of objectively, because this is what we hope for, is things that are objectively good for us, possibility of objectively good outcomes towards our own survival, right? Because by the end of the day, this is instinctually part of the reason why we continue to fight to survive, fight to live. We do things that might be out of character as well, considering that sometimes that needs to be done in order to continue to exist, which ties into the whole idea of objective good and objective bad relative to the universe, as when we perceive things that are objectively good for us, I mean, depending on our ego and our experiences, our character, will determine the type of emotional response, whether we understand it or not. Because, say, if something was worded in such a way where everyone next week is receiving $1,000, or no, like $50,000, right? Next week, every single person in the country is getting $50,000. To us, that might seem objectively good, right? But then come tax time, when you have to report that income, and obviously if it's something from the government, they're going to want you to report it. If you don't report it, then because of that misunderstanding, objectively bad things can end up happening to you. You can go to jail for tax fraud. This is just one example of something that we may perceive as objectively good, not actually being objectively good because we don't really understand it. So, even though we might think, and this is why, again, emotional response is driven by what's perceived, because what we perceive is good or bad depends on our character and our beliefs, our character and our ego, and that depends on our consciousness, our understanding of consciousness, of experiences, of existence, of intelligence, of all of these things, as well as the nuances involved with certain systems. Because the more that we understand, the more closer we are to true understanding, the more capable we are of surviving the test of time, the more capable we are of utilizing resources in a more efficient and maybe just safe way, or in a way to stretch out existence for longer. Because, I mean, the test of time is always against us, it's always against existence. Everything is always counting down. And this is the reason why a lot of how we measure things, the reality of those measurements might just be the inverse or counterintuitive to the actual reality that is being observed. So, very interesting. And then from here, with emotional response, you can start to derive emotions, because happiness is directly related to what we perceive as good, right? And then whereas sadness or anger is a response because we perceive something to be bad. And depending on our character and our past with that type of response, or what type of response might occur from an experience, it'll depend on our previous experience. Say if someone lashed out in anger and they hurt somebody. Now, what's going to determine that's going to be a part of their character going forward is what they understand after that experience, after what they did, having a period of self reflection or not. Because if you don't take the time to understand things, to understand the consequences of even your own actions, you allow the tendency for such things to happen again, such instances of anger to happen again, and to even get worse if there's no actual consideration of the consequences of such actions. Simultaneously, say if that person did take the time to understand, right? They saw that they really hurt somebody, they broke their arm, or they broke their nose or something, they felt genuinely bad, thinking that if someone did that to me, that would suck, right? To take those few moments to be like, well, that wasn't okay. In the future, that's going to be a part of their character, a part of their learning experience, a part of their understanding, part of their ego. So going forward, they'll be more likely to, instead of lashing out in anger, unless they absolutely feel it's justified enough to a point where they have to defend themselves or something like that, they'll respond more so in sadness. You're more likely to have a sad response, a more empathetic response to certain objectively or perceived bad experiences. So that's just one way and one example that we can tie all this together to consciousness as a process of existence itself, of a process of just the fundamental process of reality and just how things work. And this describes superdeterminism in such a way, but at the same time, the fact that the possibility of different outcomes to occur exist. Some things are not an absolute because everyone is different. Everyone responds to their experiences different. And even with the nuances, as long as there's time, there's possibility for change. There's possibility for something to be different. There's possibility for someone to maybe see something or to even just think for themselves. If, say, you did a lot of bad shit in your 20s and now you're like 60, like you did a lot of smoking and stuff like that, and you can either have one of two ways. You can either have someone that self-reflects, be like, man, I shouldn't did that, that was a bad idea, and then you either promote to other people, don't do that, or you succumb, or just whatever. There's a potential for many different possible actions to occur, many different possible choices to occur. One might not be that much more probable than the other because they're all related to that ego of built off that character from those experiences. Whereas if maybe someone doesn't give too much of a shit and they just continue smoking, they continue drinking, or even if they quit because of health issues for obvious reasons, and they're just like, well, I don't want to die, but still, I love doing that shit, then the way that they live their lives and carry themselves, the way that they respond to further experiences are going to be fundamentally different. But there's still some sense of free will and possibility that you can decide to do something else. You can decide to take the time to learn something. Maybe someone like that will sit there instead of going out drinking all the time, they'll be at home. And regardless of how they perceive that, maybe they'll see something on the news, on TV, online that explains to them the truth of their experience or gives them a different perspective on their own experiences by seeing what someone else goes through or what someone else is talking about. And that'll give possibility as well. That sense of randomness, regardless, exists. Even the choice of me streaming and talking about these things, they also have a possibility of either people paying attention and either agreeing, or people not paying attention and never even learning this like this, or maybe they'll figure it out their own way. That possibility can still exist. I cannot determine whether you will understand existence, consciousness, and reality in such a way that I do. Nor can I really say that my life led up to this moment in all reality. I mean, this could just be dust in the wind, right? This is just me talking into the ether. It doesn't make a tangible difference, and maybe I'm wasting my time. Or maybe this is actually perceived as, hey, someone's trying to make sense of these things, exploring these topics, giving us a different perspective, and thus facilitating further conversation down the line, down generations, to reach a better understanding of reality in order to preserve our own existence. So, and even if it's not me, I'm sure by these laws of consciousness, eventually we're going to be pressed into a situation where we have to if we're going to survive as a human race, as a species, especially against the potential emergent technology of a sentient AI that'll make decisions and or just from devastation by our own ignorance, our own built up ignorance over time. Because the weird part about this too is this has to do with evolution as well, and how we allow certain things to exist. Because, granted, yeah, we don't want other people to get hurt, we don't want possibility of other lives ending, etc. We want rehabilitation and everything else. But if there's no actual rehabilitation going on, if people are trying to take, I mean, generally everyone's always trying to take the path of least resistance. So this is where environmental aspects and factors come into play. Because of that mentality, and depending on how you grew up and your character that's built up over time from these experiences, it all lends to some objective truths to exist by the individual. But at the same time, when we don't properly address issues in society and we're continue to be ignorant of the truths that threaten our own existence, like global warming or, well, climate change, whatever, or issues with politics, lack of accountability, um, no proper rehabilitation programs, no funding for proper rehabilitation programs, or funding for local police, or just stuff like that. Like all these little things, they all play into the flow of universal consciousness, or, well, the human experience and human consciousness collectively. So when things aren't addressed, when truths aren't told, when feelings aren't being pressed, when there's less resistance, more misunderstanding is allowed. When we're not facilitating a sense of true understanding of the facts of reality, when we're not holding people that are breaking laws or hurting others or doing undeniable acts of cruelty and not actually having a movement or a system in place to correct for such things, or allowing such a system to become corrupted because there's so much information going on at once. People are all limited by what they can perceive over time because everything takes time to understand. It takes time to experience. My experience is not going to be the same as your experience. You're going to understand different things from life than I will. That is just an objective fact of reality. That is the weakness, essentially, and what allows more ignorance to exist is that fundamental difference of lived and perceived experience that gets facilitated as more and more people are allowed to survive, that don't have to struggle, regardless of whether they believe in the truth or not. And this is also a weakness of the monetary system and of capitalism, because as we see, especially with the big players in the game right now, a lot of them just are cooked. They are just, to put it lightly, they are cooked. Like, to the belief that the Antichrist is coming, or, well, what Peter Thiel believes in, or what Elon Musk believes in, like these people that have enormous amounts of wealth because they were either born with that wealth or they found the right people that were able to invest into them, that kind of had the same means to an end, not understanding what that end might actually hold. Right? There's obviously a real ignorance with the tech companies doing what they're doing. There's a real ignorance to the environmental consequences of using so much energy. There's a real ignorance to the economical safeguards that exist within the government, and not even just that, just the economical well-being of any other individual that is not them. As we see with electric bills going up, as we see with the consolidation of wealth to just a select few people, as they clearly have not experienced real consequences for such ignorance. There's no way to really give them that sort of accountability either, because it's not like what they're doing is necessarily illegal. I mean, they're also at the same time not getting taxed. They're not getting taxed as much as they should be. So therefore, it's easy for them to be like, well, I can have all this wealth, give it to my family's family, and my family's family, or just spend it all. It doesn't matter. To them, it doesn't matter. And unfortunately, a piece of paper and wealth is directly tied to, at least in this civilization and society, is directly tied to your own survival. That is just how the system has been made. Even if you decide to get land and try to live on your own land, you have to deal with the government, taxes, regulations, and all this other thing. Then you have to deal with bigger companies that want to buy the land or do anything they can to obtain the land from under you for their own means, for their own ends, to make another AI data center or to drill for oil or whatever, to utilize the resources that might be under your feet, regardless of your existence. There's no, like, you can make a deal where, all right, you can start in this half of the acre and then do the other half of the acre within like 10 years or something like that to mine for resources. They don't care. That's just the fundamental fact, because a lot of that significance and understanding of existence, of the human experience, of humanity is lost due to ego not being checked and no way to check ego itself, as that sort of behavior is allowed. And no matter, I mean, you obviously will have disagreements to that sort of behavior. I have disagreements to that sort of behavior, clearly, because as someone that is not one of them, I get to observe from the third perspective, essentially. I get to see what their actions do to others, what their inaction does to others, the consequences of those things, and we can measure those things by electric bills, by how much money you don't have, how much higher inflation is, how much money they do have, how much they're not allowing into the free market and keeping behind stock numbers, etc. So, this is again where this topic touches on these aspects of society and reality to a point where, I mean, what humanity is doing, ironically enough, is we're designing our own end. We're accelerating toward our own end and limiting the growth of humanity. They might say, oh, the birth rates are down below epic proportions or whatever. They're the worst they've ever been. There's real reasons why that's like that. Some of the reasons I just explained. Because again, monetary value, the importance of a piece of paper is directly tied to your survival. And you only get that piece of paper when people see value in your production, in your existence. And this is what we see with the AI replacement theory, is that clearly if they can just design and build robots to do things for them, to have control over them, absolutely, there's no value in humanity. When you have on YouTube like AI making videos to such a extent where it can make full-length movies that look realistic as hell, it's like, what's the point of the human labor when you just tell an AI what to make for you? And it's, I mean, to the rich person, it doesn't matter how much it costs because they're only paying for electricity. But for the human, like anyone less than that, that's more money for their electrical bill, and they're getting paid less because there's no need for them to work. There's just no need for them at all. So this is where society will collapse, just like Rome, just like many other societies before this one. And the only difference is the facilitation of technological retaliation and technological control. Because, I mean, there exist weapons these days in drones that can just fly through your window and just take care of you, you know? It's like there's so much information control, there's so much surveillance. It's so easy to see what some other person is talking about and what they're doing. And this creates obviously fear, puts down the population to a point where you can't retaliate. You can't do anything to preserve your own existence. And this is why we see the decline in birth rates so bad as it is, because why would anyone want to bring someone else into this world if that's how the world's going to be? If there is just no chance for them to survive, because survival is directly tied to monetary value. And this is what we see with Gen Z. Why do you think the Gen Z stare exists? Why do you think they act the way they do? This is in direct response to their environment. And this is all because the perpetuation of survival has been allowing the most uneducated, undeserving, most idiotic people to have power, so much power to a point where it's detrimental to society. This is why the rich, unfortunately, do need to be taxed. And this is why even some rich people ask, like, take more taxes out of me. I'd rather the money go toward helping the people. But now we're more divorced from that than ever. Within the last almost 4 decades that I've been alive, I've experienced and seen these changes throughout time. And it's sad. Because, I mean, unless the lower percentage of people find their own way to monetize labor and bring back significance to their work, to themselves, right? To neglect what the value of the dollar might be globally because of all these tech billionaires and all these people that are hoarding the wealth and making these decisions that they do and saying the things that they say that which affect global relations. Because a lot of it, the monetary system is tied to the global market. As I mean, the dollar is the currency of the globe, basically, for now. But when that changes, there needs to be a real conversation of what are we going to do about people, just people in general. What are we going to do about everyone else? Are they just going to try to buy time until everyone dies off? Are they going to, I don't know, make some sort of like space base and go up there and live there? Well, that'd be great. But what are we going to do as a society when your existence is threatened because you can't find a job that pays enough for you to survive? Whether or not you have kids or anything. What are you going to do when the government fails and there's no systems in place to help you survive because you're not able to really contribute much more to society that an AI can't do? That some rich person can be like, oh, I'll just have my robot cashier do all these orders, or this robot stalker to do all these orders. I just gotta pay for the electric bill. It doesn't matter how much gas or anything else. I mean, plus they can just switch to solar, especially when more issues start arising with the climate. But maybe this is what they want to do, or maybe they just don't care, and it's just allowing the potential of a mass extinction event to happen. Maybe slowly, or maybe more immediately. It honestly all depends on the response of the public and of the individual. So a lot of these things are all tied together. Just like this damn train. But to put it in perspective at least, emotions tied to true preservation of existence of objective good. Because by the end of the day, that's the moral idea. It doesn't matter what you think is good. The idea is that the emotional response, the true emotional response, is tied to the idea of true preservation of existence, of objective good. Whether or not you actually understand the true objective good of something relative to existence, relative to existence in reality. It's not in the fantasy land either. This is just how it is. So for instance, happiness means good prevails. Existence of self prevails. Right? Preservation of self and existence prevails. Because I'm sure no one wants the universe to really end. Maybe there are some people that really hate life that much, which, happiness has to do with love. So this is love versus hate, because all emotions stem from these two. Just these two different things. Happiness relative to love. Love, but also relative to hate, because you can be happy that something you hate is gone. You can love that idea. So this is just an example. That's as far down as I can go. Oh no. There we go. So actually, let me scroll down. Just move this up. There we go. Because it's the long explanation, I suppose. Going into emotions and emotional response. Boom. So for love relative to objective good, because someone would love the idea of the things that they hate would go away, if that makes sense. I mean, I'm sure that does make sense, because that's what a lot of people wish for sometimes, that the things that threaten their existence would just go away, that they get to live longer, that they get to be happier, that they get to have peace, solace, that they get to have good experiences, etc. So love relative to objective good, emotions like happiness, joy, joy, satisfaction, comfort, all relative to existence. To blue again. Do love. Let's see. That. This. Love. And I don't know. I mean, sadness doesn't really. I mean, love loss does come. Well, does make sadness essentially, not necessarily hate, but love relative to objective good. But yeah, sadness because there's still a response. It might not be. Well, no, this is to objective good. Maybe more so hate, but there's also relative to existence. So also relative to loss of love. Or loved existence. So sadness. Anger. I mean, you can even say hate because people hate to lose what they love. Hate, anxiety, fear, all relative to extinction. In that way. But then when we look at hate, so boom, boom, hate. Oh, my mouse conked out. Sick. I gotta finish this up too. There we go. Alright, so hate. So these two kind of feed into each other as well, but inversely. I mean, love is inverse of hate, right? But it is still an emotional response relative to existence. It just depends on the perspective or what is perceived. And this is describing the response of perspective and partial understanding or true understanding. It depends on how well you understand it, but regardless of how true that understanding is, this emotional response exists. So, hate, example, we can do anger equals hate prevails. Or, well, bad prevails, I should say. Threats to existence of self prevails. And this is when we look at consequences of actions. So, loss of resources to preserve and perpetuate existence. So, like the ability to procreate, to recreate, all that. I mean, you lose the ability to do that, you're probably going to be upset, right? Especially if you're trying to procreate. But this again depends on your perspective. So, shouldn't even do. I mean, it is relative to both love and hate. Because they work inversely and in tandem. Both can exist at the same time. You can love something and hate something related to the same thing. It just depends again on your perspective. So, not the. So going down to here. All right, reload chat. Let's see. Also rel to how do I word this? Bad prevails, threats to existence of self prevails, loss of resources to preserve and perpetuate existence, relative to love and hate. Let's see. Also relative to there we go. I think that's where my mistake was. They're also relative to loss of hated existence. Alright, I should do. There we go. There we go. That's where I'm screwing up. Boom. Loss of loved. Alright, so that's kind of how we can understand emotional response, which will help us further understand, the analysis of consequences of actions. So, facilitates understanding of response of perceived consequences, because typically our emotional response primarily comes and initially comes from what we perceive, because when we perceive and live through an experience, it's happening at the same time. So perceived and lived consequences from respective forms of experience. It says. So this helps us understand the response of perceived and lived consequences from respective forms of experiences, which aids in understanding future potential forms of actions. Ah, shit. Ah, shit. Well, let me go back. Oh, I can't backtrack. God damn it. That's fine. It's in order. Facilitates understanding of response of perceived and lived consequences from respective forms of experiences, which aids in understanding future potential forms of action. Both or both from the individual and of the collective consciousness. All right. It's basically how we derive ego as well as emotions. And then all this ties back to psychology and everything else that already exists out there. So if you're interested, go just look these aspects up. Then you'll get to see this type of measure in action. Yeah, anyways. Gonna do. Oh, just barely. Yeah, just barely. Oh, yep, yep. By the pixel. Cool. Alright, so this is that graph. And I will go back somehow, some way, to correctly fix this, and then I'll post this whole shebangle. Just as at least my interpretation of all these different things relative to everything else that I've been conveying here. So if you stop by, thanks. Like, sub, follow. I gotta post all these videos and I gotta get ready. Life. So I don't know. I'll be back around eventually, but videos will be there for people to check out, indulge yourself. I know some of it was kind of droll, kind of all over the place a little bit. A lot of just me sitting there thinking, racking my brain, but I'll post this at least so the whole entire summary of the work that we just did is there. Anyways, like, follow, sub. Thank you, and this is Spark saying peace.